those of you that are new, this is a 750 drill that I'm going to talk about today. This applies more to just the box drills, air seeders, 90 series, 50 series, 60 series drills. The same principles apply. The openers are essentially the same. So basically, I wanted to do this in the field to tell you more about what to look for. We've made a few passes here with the drill in the ground to give you an idea of what is happening and what to look for. I know I had quite a few questions from people of, well, how do I know if I'm getting to the right depth? What is the gauge wheel firmly on the ground, or how does that look? So I wanted to do in the field to point out some things that would help you to evaluate in the field based off what we see here at Exapta. Can everybody still hear? Are we still connected? Yep, I got it.
Yep.
So this does have Uniforce hydraulic cylinders on the back rank. The front rank is still springs. Basically, for starters, this is an oat field. This is oat stubble. It's got some cover crop in it. I guess I'll start with, if you have questions, I will take questions after we're done. We'll kind of go through the questions through the chat room, but if you have any that come up during this, please let me know and I will answer that. I'm going to start off with the drill here in the ground, tell you what I'm seeing after this pass. We just stopped right here. Everything's in the ground where it should be. Show you what I'm looking at, what we see. After that, we'll get into some of the further questions you guys had about when to replace this stuff. There's quite a few bushings, when to grease it, just general maintenance. I'll touch on that later. But for starters, we'll talk about this in-field adjustments. So we have a few Exapta parts on here. Most of this drill is stock. Key differences. First of all, none of these adjustments will make sense unless you have this big rock shaft where the row units are attached, unless you have that tipped backwards. So you have to have enough down pressure on the row units to get this big main pin slightly downhill. You do not want this to be level or even uphill. That means the openers are probably not in the ground where you need them. There's more to that. Let me point out here. So I'm sure a lot of you already know this, but for those of you that are new, or if you need a touch up, I don't know, a lot of times there's things we forget after we're running in the field. On the seed boot, the angle is so important that you need to have that rock shaft fully tilted up, because this seed boot, if it's down, the seed boot will be running parallel to the ground. That's not necessarily ideal. Your seeds will be shooting backwards, especially on an air seeder. If you're running too high a pressure, it'll blow seeds out the back. So this angle is critical. The more you can get this angle upwards, the better. And that's why having the rock shaft further backwards, tilted uphill, is key. That's the first thing you should be looking at. Usually that's a sign that you're not running enough down pressure to start with. So make sure you check that when you put the drill in the ground. Make sure that the openers are correctly angled. So that's at the front here. Let's talk about springs versus cylinders. Like I said, this one has cylinders in the back, springs in the front. With Uniforce, it's important because this is a radial linkage. They pivot on one point. So springs, as this goes through the ground, tend to relax. And that is an issue. This coil spring, this toolbar right here, as we have it, this one is not as tilted back as the Uniforce cylinders are on the back. Part of that is just weight. Box drills especially, they're very light. So that is critical Usually having not enough weight is a bigger issue. You can see there is a full rack of weights on the back. These drills come standard with a place to put weights. They've got 10 on here. Bare minimum, that's what I would want. Talking further, going back to the row unit. Let's see, so we got seed boot angle correct. One thing that I will point out here in the field that I'm seeing, they were sowing cover crop with this drill and they're trying to go pretty shallow. So going shallow is not necessarily the easiest when you're no-tilling, and that's where usually there's plenty of moisture in no-till. That's why we tell you to no-till. There's usually a lot there. Very rarely out in Kansas, possibly Western Kansas, you're seeing the drier soils, but for the most part, there's moisture. Sometimes you have to go deeper to get to it. But when you're seeding shallow, it's much easier to hairpin the residue. This one looks like it was clearing pretty well, but there is places here. Come back here. So right here, you can see where this residue it didn't really cut. It's pushed down into the furrow. That is exactly what we're talking about, where you're not really cutting it. It's getting shoved in there. The seed can lay on top of that and not have enough moisture to germinate, first of all. This is pretty crumbly soil here. I know there's a lot of places with the higher clay content, not so much the silt loam. It's a lot harder to close. That's another reason you want the spoke wheel, which we'll talk about that. Other things, let's see here. Let me see, let me point out. Going back to the seed boot with the angle. If you have any play in the seed boot, you can tell how the seed boot would want to be floppy. This one is actually not terrible. It's got some play, but you can tell how that would affect your seed placement. If you have basically over 3/4 of an inch for sure, over a 1/2 inch of play is too much. That seed boot will be flopping around, throwing seeds backwards more. There is a fix for that. This drill has the Pro Stitch, which we've been carrying. I know in the past there's been some issues. We didn't necessarily trust that it was fully solving the problem. We still had some customers with some plugging issues. What we figured out seems to be that you can over tighten these bolts, these little jacker bolts up top. And that if you take 100% of the play out of the seed boot and you have it completely solid, that's where you have issues. Even from the factory, if you look at a brand new Deere drill, there is a little bit of play here, 1/4 inch, 1/8 inch to 1/4 inch of play from a brand new seed boot. And there's probably a reason for that. You don't want it completely solid, and that's kind of what we saw with the Pro Stitch. So the Pro Stitch is still the easiest method, especially on these older drills, to take out the seed boot play. You don't have to do any drilling, but just be aware that that can be the issue or the problem. Just make sure you don't over tighten those, get them snug, get most of the play out. So you can kind of tell that this is not necessarily cutting too deep. Further on the seed boot issue, while we're at it, running in the middle hole essentially is where you always want to be. If you want to run shallower, you can put it deeper, but you'll wear your seed boots out faster. You can explain what you mean by that. So there's 3 holes. On the new Pro Series, there's only 2 holes, but you run in the middle one. That's basically where you want to be to seeding for typical seeding depths, 1/2 inch to 2.5 inches. Let's see. Bear with me here. Let's go talk further about what I'm seeing with these depths and what to see here. So I set these openers up to seed a little deeper than the others. You can see here, hopefully you guys can see, I was able to see it earlier on the camera. You can see the seed flap is perfectly covering the back of this seed boot. But also, hopefully maybe you can see there's these little cracks, these little fissures in the furrow right here. That's what we're talking about with gauge wheel pressure. And that's what I mean by having enough downforce, having the rock shaft fully extended. If you're trying to seed deeper, this would be, let's see, past the second knuckle, over 2 inches deep, which sometimes, especially out west where you're trying to reach moisture, that's very possible scenario. These fissures can form. The drier the dirt, the more you see this. That's why I would always err on the heavier side for down pressure. It helps prevent this. It keeps pressure. So I've heard people say if you want to check down pressure, try to tug on your gauge wheels. If they pull easily or if they turn, that's a good indication, but that's not as accurate to me. It can be sliding on residue. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's firmly pushing down on the sidewall. So I'm more looking behind the gauge wheel. You might not see it here, but this is very loose. It's raising up some, which I have this set almost as deep as it'll go, but this soil is very loose. That's not enough pressure. That means that there was probably, the risk with this is that there was probably soil falling in ahead of the seed. With these little fissures, these cracks, the gauge wheel is letting the soil raise, and that's falling in before the seed comes out. Sometimes the flap helps that tremendously, but when you're running the field, the flap will not necessarily be down here. It will be running upwards a little bit. Our flap has a 20-degree bend to help cover that better, and it's pointed at the bottom, but it's still important for that gauge wheel pressure. You have to have sidewall compaction in order to get a proper furrow that's intact so the seed can reach the bottom. Coming over here, hopefully everybody can see this, but you can see quite a bit of residue in the furrow. Not really hairpinning. It looks like it was cut. In wheat stubble, this is an oat stubble field. There'll be a lot of these little pieces. This is, again, why we're a bigger fan of the stripper headers in small grains. Keeps it standing up higher. You don't have all these little pieces that want to float their way into the furrow. It's harder to cut little pieces. They'll find a way and they'll suck moisture out of the seed. Want to talk about disc openers? Yes. So disc openers is another reason. If you look at this stubble, that's just another reason to have your openers as sharp as possible. These were replaced fairly recently. You can tell there is still a really good bevel on there. It's obvious. The bevel is towards the seed boot. I still see drills in the field with this not correct. The bevel would be to the outside. It goes to the inside towards the seed boot. This still has a very good bevel. Replace these at 17.5 inches. If you measure down to the hub from the edge of the blade, it's 5 7/8 would be the same replacement spec. Can't stress that enough. Blades should be, if you're running any amount of acres, should be almost a yearly thing for sure. It's hard to compromise on that because that's what sets everything else up from the blade on behind. If you're not doing a good job of cutting, if the blade's too low in diameter, too thin, it'll flex some. that just sets everything up. It's really not that expensive. I would rather spend extra on the blades and figure that in. Yep. So there's a million things to talk about, but seed boots, again, if you have, this is a 50 series, if you have a 60, 90 series, you're thinking about if you need to replace seed boots or you need to upgrade. The Pro Series has improved where they have that, it's a lot thinner boot, so it'll stay in the shadow of the blade a lot better. It'll stay, and with this furrow, the seed boot will ride closer. I would recommend the upgrade. I don't see why that's not a good thing, other than maybe for some large seeds, garbanzo beans or something where it's really large. You could have some plugging issues, but overall, I've heard good things about the Pro Series boot. The narrowness of it is definitely worth the upgrade. Deere has it right. We've seen really good wear life out of the Pro Series. Some of the aftermarket seed boots, they're not, the casting process, they're not exactly perfect where they ride against the blade. There's some in basically the metal doesn't seem to be the same when they're casting them, and you have to have it flush against the blade. You want that, especially on the front side. You'll get plugging issues if that's not completely flush. Something else to consider, I guess, if you're trying to save a little money on seed boots, I would still consider Deere's. I think that's still probably the best there is yet. There's definitely going to be more coming to market, but I would not be afraid to. Speaking of which, you can't see it here. These boots were replaced fairly recently, but they'll form a little J hook on the bottom, which we'll get into that here in a second. I'll raise the drill up and talk about that. Let me focus one last time on what we're seeing here in the field. So closing, right up here is the Thompson wheel. This is where the Thompson wheel ran. You can see how nice and crumbly this is. You will not see the same with the cast wheel, and that's a big reason why any spiked wheel, the Thompson wheel, we've had especially good luck on 750. If you have bearing issues with your closing wheels, like most people do, the Thompson wheel is an excellent upgrade. It has a larger bearing, pretty much non-existent. Right here, there's essentially, you can still see the furrow almost. The wheel actually makes its own furrow. It's so heavy. There's an indentation here. It looks like the furrow, but it's really not. It's where it put all this pressure on the furrow, and the seed is packed in there tight, which we don't have any seed in the drill. But this is not, it looks closed, but it's really not. It's just the pressure from the closing wheel. Versus if you come over here, this is crumbly and loose, especially seeding at shallow depths. This will be perfect for the seed. There's still moisture down here. Here's actually the furrow. This side wall is all chopped up. It's not really too hard. And again, you can get away with more down pressure in a no-till soil. A field like this, they sowed a cover crop. I had a question on seeding in the pasture. The same principles apply. The more root structure you have, the more you can get away with the higher down pressure. Unless it's really truly wet, I would never be afraid to run a little higher pressure, because it's more pressure on your gauge wheel. It's less disturbance. If you have not enough pressure, your blade will be throwing some more dirt, and then things will be really loose. Versus this will be much lower disturbance. You'll place the seed better. And then the closing wheel, and that's another reason to run the spiked wheel, is just because the fact that you want to run that extra pressure, the spiked wheel will come along and take care of that and blow that apart, make this nice and loose. So you can get away with the down pressure, especially if you have upgraded to spiked closing wheels. Okay. Let's see. Overall, and this is in a cover crop field, this actually does a pretty good job of seeding. There's still a lot of hairpinning going on these rows. Placement of closing wheel is another question I had. So this goes back to having. There's quite a bit of play in this. I mean, this is an old 750. It's not really surprising. That's why I wanted to do uh, this webinar on this drill, because it's used. It's got play, but you can see if there's that much play, how the closing wheel, it's not as big a deal with these smooth wheels, but on a spiked wheel, you don't want that much play because it can get in the furrow and pull seeds out. 3/4 of an inch away from the edge of the furrow is where we try to set the wheel. It's hard to see here. Go over here. You're on this Thompson wheel. Full screen. So this Thompson. So in the shop, I get this question a lot. You know, if you're in the shop this winter, where do you set the closing wheels? How do you check it? The firming wheel, just drawing a line backwards off the firming wheel. Usually that's centered in the furrow. Drawing a line back from the seed boot to the back. If you're in the shop trying to set this up, 3 washers would be standard. You can take away washers to get this closer. The closer you get, the better it will crumble and close the furrow. But you run the risk of getting too close, as I said, and you can poke seeds out. This is actually probably about 1.5 inches away, which is still fairly far. You can move it, it's got play, but you can take spacers away to get that if you're confident that your arms are tight and they don't have a lot of play. Two spacers seems to be kind of the sweet spot. You can brand new, just put the 3 on there, see where you're at in the field and adjust. If it's wetter, you have tougher soils, you probably would want to do a few less spacers to get that a little closer to the furrow. But I can't stress enough that you want your bushings, you want the play in the arm to be a lot tighter if you're going to start trying to get it perfect, perfectly aligned away from the furrow. 3/4 of an inch away from the furrow is really close. Also, on the firming wheel, which is really obvious on these old 750s, the firming wheels are huge. Deere has gradually came back, gotten better on that. This Durlock is just under 1/2 inch wide, and it's very obvious why that is, because this fits in the bottom of the furrow just perfectly. You don't have, it's not riding up on the side, it's right in the bottom. A perfect ideal bottom width of the furrow, it's very hard to measure, but 5/16 would be the bottom width of the furrow if everything was correct. If the 7-degree angle on the blade was still there, so that if all the bushings are good, if everything was brand new and perfectly aligned, that's about what you would see, a 5/16 inch wide bottom. Let's see here. Talked about seed boots. Pro Stitch it's very easy to work. It will take the play out of your seed boots. There's others. You can, if you need new seed boots, like I said, Needham offers 50 series boots with a bushing kit. You can get the Pro Series, would be a good upgrade for a narrow boot. I think I really like the placement that would do. You want to get it as narrow as possible to try to fit in the furrow, because the way the single disc works, it's completely reliant on the disc cutting a wide enough furrow for that to fit. And that's why replacing things on these drills, even though it's not fun, is really important actually, because if you start losing that angle, if you start having the closing wheel get too close to the furrow, things don't work how they should, and you'll have emergence that you're just not going to be satisfied with.
You want to talk about gauge wheels at all?
Yep. This is actually pretty nice. We've got 3-inch on the front, 4.5-inch on the back. 3-inch on a drill. Yeah. People ask, if you're thinking about upgrading, which one is there really a difference? Is there an advantage to 3-inch when you already have 4.5-inch from the factory? 3-inch runs over less residue. In general, that's what you want, especially if you're no-tilling. You want to run over less. The ride will be better. Especially you can get closer to old corn stalk rows. You'll run over less root balls. I would go to 3-inch if you're considering upgrade, or if it's in the budget to just get new wheels. On a drill, just do the 3-inch. If you're in tilled ground, if you're more in tilled ground, these will float better. That would be the only reason I would consider 4.5. This is a perfect example though. This one's starting to shred off, of why you should replace them. You can see as this wheel rotates, this will allow soil to come up. So the blade's trying to come up through here, and it's pulling soil with it. If you don't have a solid lip on your gauge wheel tire, and this is shredded like this, you'll have soil falling out right where the seed is trying to fall into the furrow. Usually it's dry soil. It's not necessarily wet soil, because it's the soil that's on top. This will affect your emergence, and this is why we tell you to replace. This is the reason for poly gauge wheels now. We've got some. Ours have an air cavity to give this wheel a little flex. Needham's has extra long-lasting wheel. The same idea. You want to keep this lip intact. This is the most important piece. Try not to let them get shredded like this. Perfect example right there of what not to look for. That's why you want pressure on there. This should be replaced for sure. Let me talk about spokes. You have an example of a spoke wheel. Spoked wheels. There's an advantage if you've ever had to clean gauge wheels out. You went through a wet spot in the field. There's an advantage to these. They will self-clean. Higher residue areas, though, is the only time I would caution. If you've never had to clean gauge wheels out, or you don't really see that as an issue, I probably wouldn't recommend these. You can still get corn stalks wrapping in the spokes. If you're trying to do as we tell people to try to keep stock standing, whether it's strip or stubble, corn stalks, leaving as much residue as possible. The longer the stubble, the easier it is to wrap in here. So that's the only time I would caution on going to this spoked, open spoked. One key advantage also is you have the cast iron bearing holder. Your bearing life seems to be better because it's just a better, it's more robust to hold the bearing in there versus the plastic wheels. So 2 advantages to spokes. If you don't really have issues with bearings, you don't see mud build up, probably you'd be fine. I don't see any reason why you would. If it's not broke, don't fix it, essentially. The infield, I think we've covered. Hopefully I made the point clear of why the smooth wheels, it's worth an upgrade. These are so much heavier. You can just picture them. Once they start bouncing, they continue to bounce as you're going through the field at 7 miles an hour. The spoked wheels, since it pokes into the ground, it stays engaged. It will be closing the whole time, versus these, we see these hopping. The firming wheel is, again, 750 shows a dramatic difference, just how wide it is. It's not really doing much to actually push the seed in the bottom of the furrow. Now, on pressures, you have adjustments up here to adjust your closing pressure. Spiked wheels do not require near as much closing pressure. You should probably be in the first notch on the closing wheel. That's another difference. There's other wheels. They're a lot wider. They're more like the cast spoke. The Deere has their brand new option where they basically cut notches into their spoke or their smooth cast wheel. It's still heavy. It's still really wide, and that tends to overpack. And on a drill, I just can't see why you would want to that much packing because you're seating shallow already. Let the firming wheel do the job of placing the seed pushing it into the dirt. Don't rely on the closing wheel to get your seed to soil contact. And that goes back to the pressure. Just leave it on the lightest setting. If you really see it not closing or if it's really tough, you can move that. But in general, I highly doubt that would be needed. Firming wheel is the opposite. Let the firming wheel push the seed into the furrow. Maximum pressure at all times. Usually that equates to about 20 pounds. As the row unit goes up and down, that can change, but leave it at max. Let the firming wheel push the seeds in the furrow. That covers pressures on depth. This is usually from the factory. These are 7/16 adjustment, about a half inch. This is only in the second notch, and that's really shallow. It's very easy to see the furrow. Probably I would always err on the deeper side because you just can't cut residue when you're only trying to go anything less than an inch deep. It's hard to cut through all this mat of residue. This is a cover crop. It had oats in it. Err on the deeper side, and if as long as you're not overpacking with the closing wheel and you're not trying to pack everything in, you'll still get good emergence and not be afraid of seeding that deep. At least an inch deep. It's very hard to do much less than that to actually cut through the residue and to have good seed placement. The boot, again, at an inch or less, the boot seems to be riding up above the furrow and seeds can scatter even more easily, which seems to your seed placement is just not very good. So,
Hey, Ethan, we got a question here. Can you use Thompson wheels in conventional tillage?
yes, same principles apply. It will, as long as you have it positioned, like I was saying, at least 3/4 of an inch off the furrow, it will still close the furrow. It'll pull this dirt in. The wheel is actually at a 70-degree angle, so it's the same angle as the blade. So I would not be afraid at all to run a Thompson wheel in conventional till. You'll still close the furrow well. It'll chop up the sidewalk compaction.
And we probably won't need as much spring pressure with that wheel.
Correct. Yeah. Same thing. You'll want to be in the lightest pressure.
Mm-hmm.
Light on the closing, heavy on the firming. Push that seed down as deep as this opener is. Kind of the opposite. I had a few questions on the Great Plains double disc drills, any other double disc drill in general, setting that in the field. It's kind of the opposite of what we're trying to do here because they're relying on the closing wheel to be the gauge wheel. They don't have a gauge wheel on double disc drills. The gauge wheel they're trying to do two steps in one. We've talked about this over the years of why that's not exactly ideal because you're putting more pressure on there, and plus it's not as accurate. The gauge wheel right beside where the seed comes out, that will give you a much more accurate depth versus if that gauge wheel's back here and you're trying to gauge depth. If you picture that going up and over any type of terrain, this blade will be digging in because there's nothing there to gauge its depth. And that's why we're not fans of the double disc drills in general. But on those, I would for sure want a Keaton seed firmer, which we do sell, just to help push that seed in the furrow to get your seed to soil contact.
What would be an acceptable amount of side play, like in our closing arm bushings? When should we look to replace those?
Yep. So a half inch would be, if you're trying to be really good about keeping this correct, a half inch of play or less is kind of the goal. If you have side to side play of more than a half inch, and that's just basically, you can measure off of the row beside it, use this as your solid piece, take your tape measure to here, move it side to side and measure the play. Over a half inch is starting to get too much. I would 3/4 of an inch is for sure time to do something. Replace the bushings. Um, that the same thing goes for the firming wheel. The firming wheel is not as critical. It will kind of help find the furrow. But one thing people don't realize, yes, it will center itself in the furrow, so play in the firming wheel is not as critical. But also, if you have too much play, this thing will ride and rub on the blade. It'll hit the gauge wheel. It can hit the seed boot easier when you have too much play there. So it kind of does. If you want to keep your firming wheel in good condition, it is better to keep the bushings in the firming wheel as well. 3/4 of an inch or less. Half inch or less is probably closer to new spec. Like I said, we can sometimes see a half inch of play even from factory, brand new, but 1/4 inch is in general, I would say what you're seeing from the factory. So keeping that to a half to 3/4 of an inch or less would do a lot for this to function correctly. See.
Hey, Ethan, how do you see chats here? We had a question from Jefferson Smith. Bear with me here, folks.
Let me just go through the questions one more time. Talked about the Pro Stitch. There's other ways. The Eric seed boot we used to sell, they have shoulder bolts to help tighten that. The Needham seed boot bushing kits does the same. Both of those work very well to retighten the seed boot. You can put a 12 millimeter bolt from the factory in here. That is just a little larger. That will tighten it up if you don't have too much play in the hole. That's an easy one to start with. Pro Stitch would be probably the next one. On Pro Series openers, they've improved that. They have what they call the flag pin that comes around the front to hold that pin from rotating too much. And I've talked about this in a newsletter, but if you just try to keep up on the flag pin, replace that fairly often. That seems to be, it wears quickly. Even, I mean, 5,000-6,000 acres, we've seen quite a bit of wear to where you would want to replace that. So check that, especially if you're going through the drill at least once a season. That's an easy, it's like $12 to replace that flag pin. Retightens that up. The one thing that no one has taken care of is play in the seed boot holes themselves. Like I talked about, these new Pro Series seed boots, they seem to last forever. But they develop play in their hole on the seed boot itself. The Pro Stitch doesn't seem to be taking care of that. It will jack the seed boot up and take care of the holes in the row unit itself. But if you have the play in the seed boot holes, it's still the same size pin. You'll have to go, for sure, I'd want to go to the 12 millimeter bolt to keep that tighter. But keeping up on the flag pin is key on the Pro Series there. I did have a question on 10-inch for 7.5-inch spacing. Is there any preference? No. I would say, again, as you're further west in Kansas, I would not be afraid of 10-inch at all. You're running over less residue. You're running over, you have less openers in the field. You can get away with the wider spacing in a drier environment. Further east, there is documented yield results. You'll have 5 to 10% increase the narrower the spacing. Don't know if I'm fully on board that that's a general rule yet. 15-inch rows out east that still seem to yield. It just depends on the year, the management, but in general, I would not be afraid to go to a wider spacing, especially out Kansas out west. 10-inch will do. You'll need less down pressure. The more openers you have on here, the more down pressure it's going to take, more weight on the drill you're going to need. So that's why I would definitely not be afraid of a 10-inch opener drill. Dealing with uniforce, I had a question on getting air out of the cylinders. It really comes down to trying to get the rock shaft to get all the openers on the gang to flex at the same time and have a line cracked. So telephone pole, a ditch, something like that, where you can compress all the openers, get them in their full stroke all the way up, all the way down. You'll have a line crack. Check that line, see if there's air bubbles coming out. If you're thorough with that and you try to get all the openers compressed on each gang, usually that works to do a better job of getting all the air out, because that can affect performance. Keep that in mind. Further questions, again, I'm probably not being as thorough here. If you have more questions, don't hesitate to call us. If you just press 2, I'm in technical service. That'll come directly to me. I can answer more questions. Questions on dealing with the box drill, but just in general, seeding alfalfa or small seeds with the small seed box. This is where the deer's not really the best. The double disc drills, the Great Plains, the Crustbusters, their small seed box puts the seed back towards the firming wheel. That's much better. You can get it at a shallower depth. On the deers, I get questions of, well, what can we really do? This puts it in the same place as the large seed box, and that's not exactly what we want with the really small seeds. Well, a lot of people just have the hose hanging down so that it'll dribble on the ground and still run basically the half rate through here, another half rate through the large seed box. Just have it as a mix. That works. Shallower seeding, I get that question a lot also. How do I seed shallower with these openers? Because they only go down to a 1/2 inch, and a lot of people are trying to do a 1/4 inch. Again, I wouldn't want to do that in no-till, first of all, but if you really are convinced that you want it that shallow, I would just back off the down pressure. It's easier to do with the springs. Back off the down pressure on the whole rock shaft, so the opener, you'll have more bounce, but to get a seed that shallow, that'd be the most foolproof way to do that, instead of trying to cut another notch in the depth or something like that. It's probably not, if you're no-tilling, it's probably not going to be cutting through the residue anyway at that shallow of a depth. So going through the questions here.
Just go through the
Yep.
specs again.
Well, yeah, we'll go through the pivot, each pivot point, the specs, and what to look for. I did have a question on seed monitoring on the box drill, or in general. The box drills especially, there's really not. Loop Electronics makes a monitor that will actually, it will count seeds. I usually recommend that. They have a good one. You can get any other, Microtrack makes just a regular monitor to tell you if everything's turning. That's very simple. Box drills are a little tougher. On air seeders, for sure, Intelligent Ag, we sell it. There's a reason for that. It's monitoring by sound. There's less electronics. I wouldn't question that's probably the best on the market. Precision Planting has bought them out, so that will probably end up being the Clarity system. before too long. But if you're wanting to do better at monitoring, keep those two in mind. Let's see. Greasing the hub. I had a question how often to grease the hubs or how to keep your depth arms from seizing. Every 50 hours is what the manual says on the opener hub bearing. You can for sure, if you're running more than that, I'm sure most people grease more than that, but the hub, most of the greasable points is every 50 hours is what Deere recommends. On, let's see this question here. On the depth arm seizing, we do have greaseless gauge wheels. Eric's has had the greaseless axle kits. Works extremely well if you're on a budget and you're trying to figure out what to do if yours aren't seized up yet or you don't have that issue. Corn head grease is another one that you can inject in there. It's basically just greasing it very often, fairly often. I mean, once a day for sure to try to keep those loose. Adjusting the depth is another thing that just helps in general. Not ever, I come across quite a few seeders that have never really been adjusted. They basically plant the same depth. They're seeding the same crop so that the depth never gets adjusted, which makes sense why that would seize up. So that helps. Using cornhead grease is a little more, it stays a little more liquid. Just the grease in general, try to get that pushed out. And if all else fails, again, we do have a greaseless option on that. You want to raise it? Yeah. Then I'll talk about the play. I've mentioned this stuff already. Play in the closing wheels, play in the main pin is so critical. These have been replaced, so they're actually pretty tight. This one is just fine. Measuring from the row beside it as your points of reference. How we do it. We do offer free inspections. So if we would come out, we would essentially be measuring off the row beside it. Use that as your point of reference. Make sure you're trying to just shake the row unit itself. You can see the play in the main pin, how if that was too loose, that would be affecting your 7-degree angle. On this one, 1/2 inch or less of play on the main pin is what you're after. If you have more than a 1/2 inch of side to side wiggle, you can first rotate the pin. If it's been a while, most of the time rotating the pin will not fix it enough. It won't really last you very long. If it's right at a 1/2 inch or less and you want to keep that tight, you can just loosen the retaining bolt, rotate the pin 180 degrees. It will give you a little bit more life out of that pin. Closing arm, firming arm, both of those 3/4 of an inch. The closing, if you're running spiked wheels, I would try to be less than that 1/2 inch or less to keep that from riding in the furrow. Especially if you're wanting to be more aggressive and taking some spacers away from the factory 3 spacers. If you're wanting to do less than that, keep this tight. Let's see. Gauge wheel, talked about evaluating the lip, the tire overall. There's no cracks in it. Make sure the lip is fully intact. Blade, 5 7/8 from the hub to the edge of the blade is what you would measure. That'd be replacement spec. 6 1/4 would be new. It's an 18-inch blade, 17 and a half to be considered. Usually by that point, the bevel is gone. If you're wanting to do the best you can, is what I'm pointing out here of why it's so critical, because you're trying to seed with a drill. It's a controlled spill. You're trying to seed shallow. Usually, it's small grains, smaller seed. You just want a sharp blade. Cutting is so critical to this opener. I just can't emphasize that enough. Other things to look for, the firming wheel, again, you can have bearing play in this. We have an easily replaceable bearing. Closing wheel bearings, things like that to look for. That's mostly the seed boot play. Like I mentioned, a half inch. I don't know if you guys can see that, but up and down play. If you can grab the seed boot and wiggle it and shake its hands, to say that's too much. Also with the seed boot,
Show them from the front.
is the leaf spring, which is what keeps the seed boot against the blade. It should, with firming wheels holding it, but it should snap back. You should hear a loud ping when you pull the seed boot out. You want it to be tight against the blade. If your leaf springs wore out, it won't do that. It'll just be nice and soft. It won't be a loud ping. Usually when you're doing anything to the seed boot, just replace the leaf spring, or for sure check it. I mean, but if you're taking it off, it's much easier to put the leaf spring back on. They're very cheap. Not a big issue there. Seed flap as well. They'll get narrow over time. And Ninja flaps last pretty good. They do last a long time because they're very flexible. The material is poly. On that subject, there's other seed flaps. We have ours narrow. It's tipped at the bottom. It's a V shape, just like the furrow. It's got a forward bend to it so that it's covering up this gap better, because the seed boot, again, as long as you have your angle correct on the rock shaft, the seed boot tends to ride up, or won't ride up. But if it does, the seed flap is what is holding that seed in place. Keep that from getting too narrow. Keep that from getting shredded. If you're running deeper, this flap will shred faster. So just check those. See if there's any other questions here. Yep, 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch on firming and closing it, like I've said. Which, again, the 750, yeah, it's noticeable. It's very obvious that there's play in it. Touch on Uniforce one last time. So having a cylinder on every row keeps this down pressure more consistent. You should be running rock shaft in the max position to keep the toolbar and the rock shaft rotated correctly, but Uniforce will take over after that and keep the pressure on each cylinder the same. The springs tend to relax as you're going through the field, because this is a radial arm, a radial linkage. It only pivots from one point. As that goes up and down, that spring was not holding the same pressure because it's not straight up and down. And that's an issue, and that's what Uniforce is trying to solve. Let's see. that might cover. Looks like that's about all the questions most people had. Um, yeah, that's kind of my brain dump for the day. But one other thing that I will mention that's not really applicable to this, but on air seeders, I don't think people give enough thought into the fact that we've recently started carrying air guard products with they have a venting unit. There's others that already have carried it, but venting air on an air drill is really, it's more important. I'm surprised that there's not a factory option for it, because you want to run a higher air pressure through the primaries to get to the secondaries, even through the secondaries, to prevent plugging, especially if you're running fertilizer, which I would for sure recommend. It's well proven to run some phosphorus with the wheat, helps it early on. Any even cover crops, any pass, I would probably want to put some fertilizer with the seed. So those higher rates, it's easier to plug. So you want to run higher pressures, higher air pressures to get things to flow through. But you want to vent that because, again, as it comes out the seed boot here, the seed boot is not fully always in the furrow. If you're seeding shallower, the seed boot is not really in the furrow. It's just easier for seeds to blow out, for things to blow out of the bottom on these drills. So that's why I'm surprised that venting is not as important as it is. That's one of the reasons why we've started to carry these venting units. We've carried venting units in the past. We've had the seed view, which is where you can vent um, the airs at the primary towers. The only disadvantage to those is your secondary lines have to be very straight. You really can't vent enough air to get that through the secondaries. On 5-section drills, larger drills where you're folding, it's really hard to get those tall enough to do that ideally. So these new ones, you're venting air closer to the seed boot, so you can get more of a gravity drop right as it comes out of the seed boot. I can see that being a big deal, to not worry so much about plugging, to run a higher fan speed, and being able to vent that right here to get your gravity drop. Your seeds aren't blowing out of the furrow. If you're trying to seed shallower like this, it would be a huge help. There's a lot of benefit to that. So keep that in mind. We'll be talking about that more. I'll have a newsletter on this. We talked about it in the past for sure, but did want to touch on that subject, that it doesn't get enough credit for what that would do. Just looking at the questions here one more time. As far as life on these bushings, for the closing or firming or even the main pin, mainly closing firming, because the question is on greaseless, which is the better life. I would say they're very similar. I wouldn't say that there's you probably will get a little better life maybe out of it. Depends on how religious you are with greasing. Um, I've yet to really see that many that are just absolutely perfect. It's very hard to keep dust out. The greaseless ones have better seals. It keeps the dust, the larger particles out that will eat that up. Even with grease, unless you're constantly pushing that out, the dust will get in there. It'll turn the grease more solid. So it's hard to keep the grease ones from getting seized. So I would still be in favor of the greaseless. They're going to last longer. The seals are better. I don't really know anybody that enjoys greasing that much. So to eliminate those on a 90 series, I that would be I would be all in favor. It's probably gonna cover it. There's there's any more questions, feel free to put it in the chat. Sure, I ran through this pretty quickly. Again, we have newsletters on our website. You can reach out to me or anybody at Exapta. I guess one last thing is just on the weights again, because I mean everything with these openers is so dependent on that the rock shaft being at the correct angle and having enough weight, first of all, to leverage. Uniforce, if you don't have enough weight, putting Uniforce on to leverage against won't do anything. You want to have enough weight. If we were to put these in openers in the ground again and really put the pressure on Uniforce, it's very easy to raise the rear end of this drill. We see that a lot when we do a Uniforce install. It's no longer, it becomes very obvious just how light the drills are and how much weight is critical. On larger air seeders, the wings will raise first. Having weight out on the wings and having weight on the correct part of the back, the rear is what will lift first. The front, the way the radial arm is, it leverages down against it, so the front of the drill is not as critical as the back, as having your weight in the back. No further questions. Yeah, I guess I won't keep you guys any longer than need be. If you see anything else, reach out. I'm sure there's more that I could talk about, but in general, it's keeping the row units correct, the bushings from too much play, so everything flows together correctly. There is a few other things I'm thinking about here. There's larger blades out there. They're trying to tell you to get better blade life. You can run a larger diameter blade. I would shy away from that. The row unit is designed for an 18-inch blade. The seed boot position, you can adjust that stuff, but everything is designed for the 18-inch blade. The little extra life, I highly doubt that the bevel's any greater. Again, it comes back to the bevel and staying sharp. So we've seen the best luck sticking with the 18-inch, these wear parts blades, the Forges to no blades that we sell. We seem to have really good wear life for what they are and what you're getting out of them. Last question, maybe. I'll touch on, I know I already touched on this. We've had a few people join. Just evaluating the field, because this is what doesn't always get a lot of the other webinars I've seen. They're not really in the field. They're just talking about it. Let's see here. And maybe that's because it's hard to see on camera, but I'm going to touch on it one more time anyway, because this is, if the smooth closing wheel is just too heavy, it tends to overpack this. It's not necessarily easy to find the furrow. It should be easy to find the furrow if you're in no-till, especially. The dirt is more firm. There's more root structure. You should be able to quickly find where that closing wheel pulled the loose soil over it and dig down to where the end of the furrow is, the bottom of it. And that goes further on seed placement. It's very, I've had questions also on, do you prefer a drill versus a planter? Soybeans especially, a planter will always do a better job at this. When you have two discs, they're controlling the seed placement much better. The Great Plains drills, the double disc drills, yes, the placement may be a little better, but it's because they're trying to get all the narrow placement on one toolbar. They don't have room to put a gauge wheel on there, and that's the detriment to those. They overpack. They're trying to do too much with too few parts, and that's why we've always been with the Case or the John Deere single disc drills. They're more accurate on their seed placement because of the position of the gauge wheel, because they have more steps. They have the firming and closing in separate steps. Here's the one with the Thompson wheel. You can see, just brush the soil away. It's already loose from the spiked wheel. Brush it away. You can see the bottom of the furrow. There's the two. It didn't go 100% of the way down, which is good. You don't want it all the way to seed depth. So you can see the little bit of the U furrow left. The seed should be, like I said, we don't have seed in the drill, but the seed will be pushed to the bottom of this into moisture, covered on 3 sides, and you can easily close that back up. That's what you're looking for. And back to the gauge wheel pressure. This is again why I'm saying I would always err on the high side in no-till. You have all this root structure, you have the soil structure. You can get away with a higher down pressure unless it's truly muddy. Do not be afraid to run extra pressure to keep the gauge wheels firmly on the ground, to keep your row unit ride correctly so they're not bouncing. Also, I did have a question on gauge wheel position. It's a little easier on a drill because it's not, the planer is not, this gauge wheel is not really moving up and down like on a planer, but you want the back of the lip of the tire to be firmly against the blade. You should be able to still turn the gauge wheel. You don't want it to be so tight against the blade that it's hard to turn, but you do want it rubbing. And that goes back to that seed placement that I talked about, where if you don't have it firm, if you have a gap there, the blade will bring soil up and throw the soil into the furrow, sometimes before the seed even reaches the bottom. So gauge wheel position, removing or adding shims to get that correct is another thing to check. Seed tubes, we do sell a stainless tube. Running fertilizer, especially, the seed tubes tend to seize up this little bolt in there that holds the seed tube. You can get, if you're in taller stubble, you can get cracks, frays in the seed tube. Replace that. In general, checks on this stuff, the hoses and stuff, that's very general. Look for cracks, look for soft spots.
What drills do those seed tubes work on, Ethan?
All of them.
Because I believe, are those compatible with box drills too?
Yep, because there's some that are straight. We sell lefts, straights, and rights.
Okay.
So, yep. Make sure there's not any more questions. I will say this is a John Deere, the Case P500 or their new P550 drills. They do an excellent job as well. They're different than the John Deere, and if you're running it, I'm sure you already know, but it is a parallel linkage. It's more like a planer. It's more accurate that way. They do have a very good opener. I would not be afraid of the Case P500, P550 drills. The opener is very robust. The only thing that they're missing that we can solve the problem is a firming wheel and a spike closing wheel. Their closing wheel that they have leaves a lot to be desired. In no-till, it really doesn't close very well at all. You can put a Thompson wheel on there. We do Atom Jet out of Canada. They do offer a firming wheel to go on there. We'd sell Keatons to go on it as well, that attach to the seed boot. So you can get the firming and closing steps correct. because they have the front of the seed placement is very good on the case drills. Probably actually even a little better than the Deere, to be frank. They've solved that stuff well. They've just, for some reason, they decided to omit the firming and closing. I don't see any more questions in the chat. So we will did have a final question on narrow gauge drills. Yep, that's what I was touching on. I'm a big fan of them on drills. You're on a narrow row spacing. You're running over less residue. This one has the 3" on it. I definitely on a drill I would be running the narrow. Unless you're switching between tilled ground or some lighter ground where you want the extra flotation. They'll wear out less fast, and they won't wear out near as fast. 3" would be, if you're needing replacement, the way I would go. This will be recorded, so we'll have this posted to YouTube here later on. I appreciate everyone that did come in. This did go a little fast. There's a lot to talk about, and we try to touch on this more in newsletters, and we'll touch on this more. Again, free inspections. If you have an air seeder or a drill and you're just wanting a second opinion,